Fatima alEwy, 25, holding her 3-year-old daughter, Haneen. alEwy, a Syrian refugee, fled to Lebanon, where her family has faced hardships. Ibarra Sanchez for the New York Times HALBA, Lebanon. In her 3-room apartment here, Fatima alEwy yearned for her old life in Syria. "We had a nice life, a simple life, a comfortable life," said Ms. alEwy, 25, her face lighting up last month as she described her family's former home in Homs, in western Syria, with spacious rooms and well-equipped bathrooms and kitchen. The unrest after the Arab Spring changed all that, and by the end of 2011, she stopped leaving the house because of the clashes in her neighborhood. Her future husband, Ibarra, who lived nearby, was dodging sniper fire just to get to his university classes. "I would go to class, but all I could think about was how I would get home," Mr. Daher, 29, said. Ms. alEwy and Mr. Daher, who both spoke through an interpreter, each fled with their families to North Lebanon. They married there in 2013 and soon had a daughter, Haneen, now 3. The family lives on the second floor of an unfinished building here. The cinder block walls have been haphazardly grouted. Water flooded the apartment the first time it rained. They spend hours every day without electricity. Their struggles as refugees worsened in March when a fire stole more from them than they had already lost. Ms. alEwy was home with Haneen when their gas heater caught fire, igniting their small apartment. "I could see the flames coming out of the door," Ms. alEwy said, pointing to a boarded-up room. "I grabbed the fire extinguisher, but I didn't know how to use it." She threw a bucket of water on the flames, but they were too big. Then the couple's mattress caught fire. Haneen with her father, Ibarra, in Halba, Lebanon. Like most Syrian refugees, he is not legally permitted to work in Lebanon and relies on sporadic undertable jobs. Ibarra Sanchez for the New York Times. Ms. alEwy grabbed Haneen and a black bag that held their important documents and ran from the home. She called Mr. Daher. "I told him, you need to come home very quickly. The house is burning," Ms. alEwy recalled. By the time her husband arrived, the smoke was so thick that he could not go inside. He broke a window and tried to spray the extinguisher into the apartment. Ms. alEwy said with Haneen as most of their possessions went up in flames, "Everything was burned," he said. Daher said he had not been able to afford the diesel recommended for the heater and instead bought a cheaper fuel. He suspects that is what caused the fire. The family still lives there, the damaged room sealed off with sheets of plywood. They had nowhere else to go. Daher and Ms. alEwy each fled Syria with their families and married in Lebanon in 2013. Ibarra Sanchez for the New York Times. "Sometimes I have work, sometimes I don't," said Mr. Daher, who, like most Syrians, is not legally permitted to work in Lebanon and relies on sporadic undertable jobs. The family does not receive financial assistance, but the rent is covered by the Norwegian Refugee Council, an aid organization. Mr. Daher says his income barely pays for food for the family. After the fire, they needed new clothes and bedding, a new heater and toys for Haneen. They borrowed some money from relatives and friends, but after years in Lebanon, few Syrian refugees had cash to lend. Desperate, Mr. Daher borrowed 500,000 Lebanese pounds $334 from a man he described only as not a friend. The unfinished building where the family has been living. A fire broke out in their second-floor apartment in March. Ibarra Sanchez for the New York Times. "After a few weeks," he said, "the man began threatening the family. He said he would get us kicked out of the neighborhood if we didn't pay him back." Mr. Daher said, "The man started coming to their home and demanding the money," he added. Ms. alEwy was so scared, she and Haneen went to stay with her parents. Daher asked many organizations for assistance, but he had difficulty finding one that would help him repay the loan. Then he turned to the International Rescue Committee, one of the 8 organizations supported by the New York Times Neediest Cases Fund. In May, the organization gave the family money so Mr. Daher could pay back the loan. The threats have stopped, but the family is still just scraping by. Ms. alEwy pointed to the gas burner and large pots she uses to heat water for bathing and cooking. "It wasn't like this," she said of their lives in Syria. Mr. Daher and his family are scheduled to be resettled in Belfast, Northern Ireland, this week. Ibarra Sanchez for the New York Times. When the protests broke out in 2011 against the Syrian President, Bashar al-Assad, Mr. Daher was studying to be an engineer. The uprising started as peaceful demonstrations, but soon there were clashes near his home in Homs between the government and opposition fighters. Homs is about 50 miles from where the family lives now, but returning is not an option. The city has been destroyed by years of war, and Mr. Daher suspects that everything has been looted from his old home. Sitting on the concrete floor of their half-finished apartment in Halba, Ms. AlEwy recalled their many moves since they wed. The second place was the worst. There weren't even walls, she said. Sometimes they would be kicked out by a landlord, other times they simply could not afford the rent. The family is finally getting a reprieve. They are scheduled to be resettled this week in Belfast, Northern Ireland. Mr. Daher and Ms. AlEwy will be starting over yet again, but this time with the promise of a future. They are among the 3% of Syrian refugees selected for resettlement to a rich country, according to the charity Oxfam. Mr. Daher said he was looking forward to having legal residency and the opportunity to work and put Haneen in school. Ms. AlEwy was cautious but optimistic. No matter what, she said, it's going to be better than this.